Welcome to episode 13 of the African Photography Safaris. I don't know why I'm saying it like that, but anyway, it sounds good. The African Photography Safaris podcast, a bird photography special. Remember, you can find all of our episodes on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, and Audible. From episode 7 onwards, we're also on YouTube, which allows us to add some wildlife visual content too. So for our bird photography special, what have we got, Alan?
So, bird photography is such an important part of wildlife photography. It's pretty much everywhere. Everywhere we go, we see birds. In our Camera Basics series, we're going to look at the frame rates, which are especially useful for bird photography. We'll have an avian wildlife wonder with a sort of Northumbrian and African theme, and a birding field guide too. But also, in addition to birds, I'm going to get quite annoyed about a well-known wildlife photography magazine.
Can we just get straight to the bit where you get annoyed?
No, I'm going to build it up. I'm going to have a few more beers.
All right, fair enough.
I need to fill a glass, actually. And if I have a few more beers, I'll probably get more angry about it.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So has somebody stolen an image?
No, but incidentally, image theft is a very good subject, and it's probably something that we should talk about in a future episode.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. It's a constant problem, and it's something that crosses genres. And we're actually both dealing with a case at the moment, which we can't talk about because we'd have to kill you. We may not be able to go into the detail here on that. Regardless, it's an issue which affects all photographers, regardless of their professional or amateur status. So coming up in episode 14 or 15, whatever, image theft.
Yeah. So anyway, back to episode 13 and our birding special. So birds definitely have a sort of enduring appeal for wildlife photographers. They're probably the most accessible subjects from gardens, woodlands, coastlines, wetlands, urban, rural areas, wherever. I do remember a little while back in Hyde when I was mainly there to photograph red squirrels, but it was also teeming with bullfinch, goldfinch, siskin, nuthatch, chaffinch, redpoll. The diversity of colours in these sort of native UK woodland species is absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, I think birds are probably a gateway drug for most photographers who enjoy the wildlife genre before moving on to the hard stuff. Birds can...
Drug analogy.
Birds can be pretty straightforward to photograph, or they can't be. It really depends on the species and their behaviour, but they can also demand a huge amount of patience, technical camera know-how and field craft as well to get consistently high-quality results, So I'm minded of something I worked on in my early days of bird photography. There's always something small, far away and in shit light, and that's the bird.
Yeah. I definitely see my own path there as well, sort of visiting places like Washington Wetlands Centre, just down the road in Tyne Weir years ago, and also going up to the absolutely incredible Farne Islands before the National Trust ruined them, a few miles further north in Northumberland. I don't consider myself to be a birder, certainly not a twitcher, but bird photography sort of represents a massive part of my photographic library, and I'm sure it probably does yours and most of the wildlife photographers too.
Yeah, absolutely. We do, of course, enjoy photographing birds in Africa too. In a habitat where the big five often dominate, we sometimes feel the bird life is a little overlooked. The Sub-Sahara region boasts incredible avian diversity, ranging from iconic species like ostriches and shoebills, penguins, colourful sunbirds, starlings, rollers, bee-eaters. The variety is attributed to its vast range of habitats, including savannas, rainforests, wetlands, deserts. There's a bit of everything there. I think it's interesting that I remember when I went to Africa to photograph wildlife there for the first time in 2008, I came back to the UK and got thoroughly depressed that I just could barely find any mammals to photograph. After having been in Africa, you just get really spoilt. All the mammals that you can find, if you can find them at all, in the UK were small, far away, and even more shit-like than the birds. That's kind of the problem in the UK. So actually, I started appreciating the variety of birds we have in the UK because they're so much more accessible than the mammals. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll have a lot of photographs up too. And guess what? An awful lot of the birds we have in the UK are migrants from Africa. Or maybe they're UK birds that are actually migrants to Africa.
Or both,
yeah, depending on your point of view, really.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's actually any scientific consensus on that, because they spend such a lot of time in both.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I did some very, very general research, and it seems to be accepted that the sub-Saharan Africa region is the sort of permanent or the temporary migratory home for roughly a quarter of all global bird species. Now, I can't reference any sort of specific source for that, but the vast numbers of species we see and the number of references in field guides that we have, I mean, it seems absolutely plausible to me. Like,
yeah, I think the huge number of birds of prey species also amazes me. You know, so many species of eagle, tawny, martial, black-chested snake eagle, brown snake eagle, battler, tawny, Wahlbergs or Wahlbergs. I don't know if you
Wahlbergs eagle.
Yeah. Mark Wahlberg. Marky Mark.
Yeah.
He's got an eagle named after him. Sure, that's true. African hawk eagle,
Maybe his grandfather discovered it.
That'll be it, yeah. And he just went on a different creative path.
It's his eagle.
You just disturbed my beautiful French pronunciation of a verreux eagle. Verreux. And so many more. And then there are the buzzards, goshawks, kestrels, owls, vultures. It really is an immense and diverse list. You know, before I forget, actually, we did a review of the bird app in a previous episode. I can't remember which one it was. Merlin bird app. Yeah,
it's very good. Yeah.
Look back in our sort of history of the apps, because I didn't make a note before we recorded this, but
it's there.
It's there somewhere.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in bird ID apps, and I seem to remember that there was quite a lot of audio recognition as well. So it wasn't just like, here's a picture of a bird, identify it for me. It was also, you know, you can give it a bit of audio and it would have a good go at telling you what it actually is.
Yeah.
Some of the results were interesting.
It's a work in progress. It's a bit of a giant citizen science project, and that's the kind of way to look at it. It's always evolving and becoming more and more accurate. And I think the addition of AI is, you know, becoming more efficient with it as well. But
definitely
you just go
worth a
through.
look.
Yeah, definitely. You know, all those birds of prey, but, you know, we've also got the scavengers as well. Birds like the vultures, the storks, so many species of heron. It's unbelievable. Grey heron, striated heron, black-headed, squawko, Goliath, green, purple, egrets, and the very sort of distinctive secretary bird too. Incredible bird to photograph and watch. But we actually reviewed the Birds of East Africa book in episode 4, and within that book, or within the edition of the book that I have, and probably you have as well, there are 1,448 species alone. So collectively, you know, there are so many more species in places like Tanzania, Mozambique, Botswana, Zambia, Namibia, South Africa. But yeah, the crossovers are there, but overall the number is absolutely massive.
Bustards. Plenty of bustards there as
National
well.
Bird of Botswana.
Is it really?
It is,
Which one? The Corey?
Corey's bustard.
Bustard, yeah. That's the biggest, heaviest flighted bird.
Yeah. They just run around because it takes a bit of effort. You do see them. We do see them flying, but
be a bit like me trying to fly.
They run around a lot.
I can fly if I run off a cliff.
Can you not remember when we went in the Mara years ago and we were sitting in the vehicle and we heard something like footprints getting louder and louder, and we were like looking around, and just this massive Corey's bustard just legged it. It was like Roadrunner or something.
Roadrunner, but like who'd been taking steroids. Yeah. I mean, every trip to Africa brings up a new species of bird we haven't photographed in the past. We may have seen and heard a certain species, but maybe not been able to get close to them or get a clear photograph. Last year, for me, it was some canaries and cisticolas, which I hadn't come across before in the wild. So it's not about rare species either. I mean, we've seen and most certainly heard the call of birds, like the white-browed cuckoo, constantly, for example, the incredibly named barefaced go-away bird, go-away, too, because in the past they've eluded our lenses. We had a really good session with them last year.
Barefaced go-away bird,
Yeah, in 2024 we had a good session with both of these, so it was a good opportunity to add them to the portfolios.
You've probably hit me bird nerd nerve there. Even though I said I wasn't
soon.
In Botswana and Timbavati, there are so many grey go-away birds that don't have the bare-faced go-away bird. So they've got the grey go-away bird, or it used to be called a grey lowry before it was a grey go-away bird. And the call's so distinct. It's probably one of the best examples of onomatopoeia. I think in birding terms, or onomatopoeia is basically where a species is named after its call. and we hear the great go-away bird so clearly. Go away, go away. It really is unmistakable.
Yeah, there's some really good examples of onomatopoeic birds here in the UK as well. We have the kittiwake, the chiff-chaff, the cuckoo, but yeah, the go-away bird I think has the comedy value to it, especially the bare-faced go-away. I mean, who named that? That's fantastic. Honorary mention goes to the ring-necked dove, not because it's got an onomatopoeic name. Now I said it. Oh God, let's do it again. Honorary mention goes to the ring-necked dove, not because it has an onomatopoeic name, but because, as we've mentioned in the previous episode, it sings, "Work harder, drink lager," and it's kind of the soundtrack to the back of any kind of documentary you might have seen on that part of Africa. It's
didn't Moses, when we did the Safari Special episode 10-11, Moses came and singing in the background.
He just appeared in the background singing.
Work harder, drink lager.
Yeah.
We had a guest with us a little while back in Namara. Has to be said, fantastic chap, Mr. Graham. Graham is a really interesting bloke, a very, very keen birder, and that's what brought him to wildlife photography. And it's how we know him when he decided to join us in Kenya. But back here in Northern England, where Graham's from, he's involved in the Northumberland and Tyneside Bird Club, where he covers social media, edits news bulletins, and he's also on the county recorder committee. So we're getting a little bit into Twitcher territory here. But yeah, there's also a really good African link here too, which is where we're going with this, because Graham does a lot of work locally with migratory swift conservation, and the RSPB fitted some GPS tags to some of the birds which were nesting in the swift boxes that he has. And the evidence came back, and the migratory route is, it's absolutely incredible. Just from a few miles up the road from here in Northumberland, they head south over the Channel, across northern France and the Bay of Biscay, through Spain and Portugal, then over to sort of Morocco, Mali, Algeria, then onwards to Nigeria, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Zambia, and then into Tanzania, and also into Kenya. So,
but they've got canny few stamps on the passport.
They must have, yeah. And then they pretty much have to do the same route again in reverse, which is incredible.
As all good birders do, Graham kept a list of all the bird species he saw when he was with us in Kenya, and in just a week he spotted 124 species, of which 111 were life ticks, which basically means that he's never seen them before. So 111 species were birds he'd just not even seen at all in the wild. We don't think he actually photographed all of them, but he describes his highlight as the enigmatic lilac-breasted roller, martial and tawny eagles, black-chested snake eagle, bee-eaters, lapwings and larks, Jackson's willow bird. I don't even know what that is.
Jackson's widow bird.
Is it a widow bird?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a widow bird, yeah. Jackson's widow bird.
You often see them in the grass. The male especially, he sort of attracts females. He jumps up out of the grass. We don't normally see them in
technique.
August, September. I remember seeing them when I was out there in March, which must be probably more the sort of breeding season, and they leap up from the grass. They've got big long tails. I think that's the Jackson's willow bird. Very dark coloured bird.
Yeah. Well, that was a particular interest of his.
Yeah.
I should say that I wasn't on this second trip, so that's why Alan knows about these with Graham. Anyway, just like the absolute nerd sitting with me now, Graham... okay, I'm a nerd as well. Graham really enjoyed photographing and observing the oxpeckers and their interactions with the mammals, and describes his time in the Masai Mara with us as still one of my favourite trips.
Which is pretty good, really, because I know Graham from social media. I know him personally. Now and again we sort of bump into each other when we're out and about, and he's a very, very well-travelled bloke. He goes all over the world, so for him to turn around and say that is still one of his favourite trips, that is actually quite a significant sort of endorsement, really.
It is, yeah. I'll take that.
But oxpeckers, absolutely, my favourite bird to photograph out in Africa. I think we've talked about them on the podcast before. I love their sort of mammal relationships, great to watch, photograph. And despite photographing so many species, there are still so many more that are eluding us,
Yeah.
A huge amount of opportunities to photograph species that we've already photographed often come up as well. So just because we photographed something, the previous week or the year before or 2 years before, we see them in different situations, we see them in different behaviours. So it's always good to, you can never have enough photographs of any species. That's where I'm going, really.
Yeah. Well, related to that, I love photographing the cattle egrets too, with herds of buffalo, and you get these big flocks of bright white birds following the buffalo around and nabbing all the insects that the buffaloes disturb on the ground with the hooves. There's always oxpeckers there and wattled starlings and things like that, and there's always something interesting going on in terms of the interaction. And that's that. There's it's never a dull moment when you see a big herd of buffalo and all these other bird species that are kind of picking off anything that either ticks or stuff that comes up from the ground.
So it's like two different relationships. You've got the oxpeckers, which is the sort of mutualism bordering into parasitism, but then you've got the egrets, which is more of a sort of commensalism thing going on. What a nerd.
I can't really say anything really. There's always something very interesting going on. We've talked about the democracy process in herds of buffalo and packs of wild dogs in a previous episode. Again, it eludes me which episode that actually was, but anyway, how animals, particularly predators' eyes work and their comparisons to how our cameras work. We've also talked about how trees can communicate with each other when they're under attack by browsing herbivores. Yep, gossiping trees. Yeah. I'm just having a bit chat on, you've seen the neck on that giraffe.
Yeah.
We're talking about birds in this episode, so it stands to reason that we'll have an avian wildlife wonder, and it's about migration, and specifically Arctic terns. We've already mentioned Graham's Swift study and how they migrate to East Africa, and that it's an incredible example of travel endurance. But there is an even greater bird migration taking place around us, and it's one that's particular interest to Alan and me here because we're based in the northeast. In northeast of England, Arctic terns, especially of the Farne Islands.
Absolutely. So the Arctic terns, they're famous for their extraordinary sort of long distance migration. Potentially, and I say potentially because I don't think it's proven, there might be some other birds in the sort of western West America, eastern sort of Pacific that do a greater migration. I'm not sure, but potentially it's one of the longest migrations of any known animal. The Arctic terns that breed on Inner Farne, one of the Farne Islands, which is just a few miles north from where we are here again in the northeast of England. They undertake this remarkable journey each year. So after breeding in the summer, Arctic terns from Inner Farne begin their southward migration around late July to early August. Typically, they'll follow a route down the western coasts of Europe and Africa, feeding the sort of rich marine waters in the Atlantic Ocean. Then they're going to reach the southern hemisphere, continue their journey towards the Antarctic. Some continue around the Cape of sort of South Africa, and then go sort of past India, where they might spend the summer, which is our winter. And in early spring, March, April, they begin their return journey northward, arriving back basically where they started in those breeding colonies, very specifically to the same place, the same nest, same part of the Farne Islands, down to the same square foot.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. And they're usually back there by sort of May.
Yeah. Actually, as part of the research I did for a book that I wrote in 2011 on the Farne Islands, I looked at a paper about Arctic terns. Actually, I just remember the journal that I looked in that was called PNAS, so I had to ask the penis for permission to quote this research. Anyway,
quote penis.
Penis, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Paper on Arctic terns. The birds have been tagged, and every year they fly from the Farne Islands down to the Southern Ocean and back again. One of the most incredible Arctic tern migrations ever recorded involved a bird originally ringed on Inner Farne. This particular tern was found in New South Wales, Australia, covering at least 13,670 miles one way, although the actual route is likely to be much longer than that because I'm sure it didn't just go in a straight line. Flight paths take average wind patterns and food availability into account, and they stop and move off, and they might do a few circles while they're feeding up, and then they'll go off again. I've actually got relatives in New South Wales in Australia, and the last time I visited, it took 26 hours on a plane to get there. Can you imagine flapping your little wings to do all that direct, all that way, just like on your own power?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You needed a lot of energy to get there. I mean, I wouldn't bother personally. Plenty of fish in the sea around here. Pubs are better anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we talk a lot about the wildebeest in Africa, and it's known as the Great Migration. Yeah, but really, in terms of distance, they've got absolutely nout on the Arctic terns at all, have they? So we know why they migrate, to take advantage of the continuous summer days, keep up the abundance of food.
I wouldn't bother.
No, I think I would rather just not bother. So we've got what next wildlife wonder here, and it's not just about the astonishing distance, but it's about how they navigate. I think that's where the real interest of the wildlife wonder is. So they're known to use what are known as celestial cues, the positions of the sun, the stars, to navigate, and also they can sense the Earth's magnetic field using a protein called cryptochrome in their eyes and in their brain. So I read.
It's pretty amazing.
It is, isn't it? And that allows them to detect the direction of magnetic field lines. Basically, it's like having a built-in compass, I suppose, in your forehead. Streamlined bodies designed to reduce the drag while maintaining long, slender wings to conserve their energy. I mean, over one single bird's lifespan, they may have migrated the equivalent of 3 round trips from Earth to the moon. And it's massive.
The pub's only good on the moon.
I don't think so. I doubt it,
When we photographed the Arctic terns on Innerfarn, we get a very quick reminder of just how fast they move, and often with very erratic flight paths, making them a real challenge to photograph in flight. They're really pretty tricky. And so focus tracking can be very, very difficult. Also because they have bright feathers, like the egrets that we've just been talking about, the cattle egrets, you have to be really careful you don't obliterate the highlights when photographing them. Always preserve your highlights because they won't recover in processing. Once you've blown up the whites, there's just no detail in there. So you can try and reduce the... I've seen people do this.
Recover.
Well, I've done it myself. I'm talking about myself. Okay.
No, everybody.
Everybody does it. You think, that's all right, I'll just reduce the exposure. And all you get is a sort of slightly less light blotch where it's just lost all of the detail.
And I think that's something that's definitely more visible in when you're trying to recover highlights in a JPEG rather than a RAW.
Yes,
that's another advantage of shooting RAW is there's a little bit more latitude to recover these highlights, and you can recover a little bit more before you then just lose that sort of greeness and horribleness.
I've also noticed that more modern cameras compared to when I first started shooting digital digital cameras is that they're just better at retaining highlight detail. I always felt that the highlight detail looked very, very artificial in the early digital cameras, and it was one of the things that kind of gave it away. And when I switched to video as well, when you're doing that with movies, with anything, any moving images, it really looks awful. In our previous Camera Basics series, we've talked about exposure and autofocus. Another important technique in setting is to use your camera's burst mode, which basically means fast, continuous frame rates. Fast frame rates can be a game changer for capturing drama in fast and unpredictable action shots. First off, what is burst mode? Simply put, it's when your camera takes a series of images in rapid succession, as long as your finger is pressed on the shutter button. When you're shooting fast-moving subjects like a cheetah hunting or a bird in flight, timing is everything. A single frame might miss the peak action, but a burst sequence gives you the option of capturing, the likelihood of actually getting that dramatic moment. You can freeze the moments. Our own eyes and brains are way too slow to register. Not all cameras are created equal when it comes to burst modes. Older DSLRs, for example, are limited by the mechanical mirrors. You might get anywhere between 3 and, say, 16 frames on a really fast model, depending on, how high up it was in the older sort of digital pantheon. Often cameras that shoot very high-resolution images can also be limited to a second because of the sheer amount of data that the camera has to transfer to the memory card. But now mirrorless cameras are the norm, and suddenly we're looking at frame rates of 30, 40, 50 a second. And at the extreme end of the scale, my Sony A9 III takes 120 raw photos a second. It sounds over the top, and it is incredible. Yeah, in a lot of situations it is a bit silly, but what it means is you get a really good chance of getting a number of sharp shots out of a burst, and that's invaluable.
It's all these fast frame rates for stills, really, they're directly connected to the video capability of the camera, aren't they?
I guess so.
sharing the same technology.
It must be, yeah, because that camera can shoot 120 frames a second in its movie mode. So,
absolutely, yeah.
But I think the difference is that it can shoot raw images, which is obviously, that's a big file, but it can do 120 of those a second.
Absolutely.
And there's no what's called blackout, which means that it's autofocusing on every single frame, which is pretty astonishing, really. The speed of these things these days it's just remarkable. However, I'm still deleting a lot of photos of my feet in the bottom of vehicles where I've accidentally.
We've all done that.
Yeah. But when you're shooting 120 frames a second, there's a lot of feet pics. Maybe I should sell. Would anybody buy? No,
not yours.
Not mine.
Like the Hobbit.
Less said about that, the better.
But it is important to understand why mirrorless cameras have this advantage. And it's also to talk about disadvantages too. With the digital SLR, in between each frame, the mirror has to mechanically lift and return, while the shutter is also opening and closing. And that's the mechanical process that limits the speed in comparison to mirrorless. That said, some of the higher end digital SLRs, they're capable of maybe 15 or 16, maybe even more now, I don't know, frames per second. So, they're no slouches.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, isn't it?
It's still pretty good. And we have spoken about the overall differences between mirrorless and digital SLR cameras in episode 4, so we're not going to sort of labour the point, but as the name suggests, mirrorless cameras don't have this mechanical process of the mirror in place, and that's why faster frame rates are really more sort of facilitated or possible by that,
Yeah. We can also factor in electronic shutters. As the technology in mirrorless cameras also continues to evolve, we can use electronic shutters rather than the mechanical shutter to speed up the frame rate. It doesn't have to actually move anything physical. With wildlife action photography, electronic shutters used to be problematic because of rolling shutter, where the top of the frame ended up being read a fraction of a second before the bottom, causing slanting objects because of the delay in, the processing. But camera processors are becoming so fast, this is less of an issue with some most recent models. In fact, the A9 III that I shoot with has got what's called a global shutter. Getting a bit nerdy here, but then we're among friends.
A bit.
What it means is that rather than reading the sensor from top to bottom progressively, the entire sensor's image is read in one go and sent to the processor, eliminating rolling shutter. So the top of the frame is taken at exactly the same as the bottom, so you don't get any. The Americans call it jello. We'd call it.
I think
rolling shutter.
It's strange because the XH2S hasn't got a global shutter, but I think the processor is just so fast.
It's just very fast.
You just don't. I've never noticed a point. I've photographed the betas and things with their wings going, and you never see it. So you've got global shutter and you've got very, very fast sort of camera processor. Really, I suppose, just moving the information around very quickly.
Do you know what I think? Global shutter and this effect of rolling shutter isn't as much of an issue with wildlife photography as it might be in, say, I don't know, street photography or, say, sports, where there are man-made straight lines. So,
perhaps,
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it is a factor, but I think perhaps in a natural environment, it's a little bit less obvious that a lamppost is bent over. You know what I mean?
I think it's the species and the subject as matters. Does your species move that quick that a rolling shutter would be a problem?
Yeah, so it's going to blur across the screen.
But a lot of fast birds would be if they've got the wings up and they're in action. It depends on how quick, doesn't it?
Hummingbirds come to mind.
Yeah, hummingbirds, beaters, kingfishers, that sort of thing, But we did mention disadvantages, and what I mean by that is we need to kind of exercise a bit of caution, really, and only use fast frame rates when the subject's movement or the situation that you're in calls for it.
Otherwise, you get Hobbit photos.
Yeah. Well, you end up with a card full of photographs of the same thing, and very, very quickly, we've all done it. I mean, only this morning I was sort of clearing a few old images off, and I think I'd left my camera on about 30, 40 frames a second and photographed some lions, and I've got about 30, 40 shots of exactly the same thing.
Exactly.
Because I hadn't gone down to something a little bit more management, like sort of 5 frames a second or something. So
Takes a bit more time to process them because you've just got that many more photos
Well,
to
just
sift
edit them,
through.
delete, and you're looking at them because you still want to pick the sharpest one, you want to pick
Yeah.
the best, and there's very little between them, and I just tend to delete them all en masse, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I always stress it's not about finger on the shutter and machine gunning style everything. I shoot sometimes at 40 frames per second for a bird. To me, it's about the advantages of having that 20 frames in half a second. That's where the drama happens. It's about short, sharp bursts.
Yeah, absolutely. Using burst mode slowly, even for only 2 or 3 or a few frames a second, is also good telephoto lens technique because lens movement and shake is often amplified with longer, heavier lenses. So if you're jabbing your finger up and down on the shutter button, it's going to create movement, and that can actually be lessened if you're taking several shots. There's often the thing where just even if you're moving the camera around a hell of a lot and you take a burst of shots, one of them is almost certainly going to be sharp.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, actually. Burst modes, fast frame rates, call them what you want, they can be incredibly powerful tools, whether you're capturing sort of high-speed wildlife, the peak dramatic action. Like I say, it's especially good for bird photography. Experiment with it. That's the way to go. It's not like film where experimenting is going to cost you, hundreds of pounds in film.
Yeah.
See how it can benefit your wildlife photography. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Old photography.
Photography. Yes.
If you were using film and you were experimenting with 40 frames a second, bear in mind you had 36 exposures in a film. It's going to cost you a few quid, isn't it? With digital, it's not going to cost you anything. So
that's true.
Just experiment.
Just time.
Yeah.
Continuing on our bird theme, we have a book review. It's another book from South African author and field guide Trevor Carnaby. Back in our very first episode, we reviewed the mammals volume of Beat About the Bush. So today we're going to look at the birds volume, which seems fitting. It's very much like the mammals version in that it isn't a typical ID-led type of field guide. It's a behavioural guide about species of birds and a very sort of Q&A sort of led type of style.
Yeah, so it's quite a tome of a book, and here it is. Beat about the bush. Everybody likes to beat about the bush, so I've heard. And I paid something like 455 rand for this, which works out for about 20 quid in sterling. I tend to buy a lot of field guides in South Africa because the pound and the rand's pretty good value.
Pretty strong, actually, the pound, yeah.
And what we have in this book are lots of main chapters. So we've got stuff like flight and design, breeding, defence, survival, food and feeding, tracks and signs and clues. So let's just have a little look in the book at some of the sort of content that it actually covers. I'm going to randomly just open the book and see what we come up with. So food and feeding methods, we've got how birds stoop, low-level acrobatic pursuit, sweeping, hawking, diving, plunge diving, and it explains how the sort of everything works from their eyes to their feathers to the sort of webbed waders, especially for webbed bird feet.
It's like way beyond a normal ID guide, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's not really an ID guide. It's not a book. No. I mean, look at the size of it. You're not going to take that into the field to identify a species.
You could use that book for hunting. Just chuck it at something.
Yeah. So what are the differences between kestrels and eagles, which is a really good sort of point. Falcons, kestrels, eagles, and sort of kites and hawks, goshawks, sparrowhawks. Why do they fall into these sort of classifications? Why do birds flutter in the dust? What is anting, active anting, and passive anting? So this is the level of details.
I actually don't know what that is.
No.
What is active and passive anting?
Well, active anting is the process where birds will use ants to assist with feather maintenance. So active anting is the bird flying down to where the ants are and actually collecting them in the bill and then vigorously rubbing the bill through the plumage, resulting in the death of the ant. But they secrete the formic acid, which is then smeared throughout the plumage. Passive anting is the bird alighting.
What's a plumage?
Plumage. Oh, man, from Northumberland, you know.
Plumage.
So this passive anting entails the bird alighting on the ground where certain ants that secrete formic acid are present. So rather than actually using the ant, because that's active anting, then passive anting is using where the ants have already sort of dropped formic acid I mean, that's new to me.
I wonder if it's a bit like dolphins pestering, is it pufferfish?
Yeah,
because it secretes a psychedelic substance and they
potentially
just go off on a trip.
Is it true that some young birds kill their siblings, siblicide, which like hyenas, we know that is absolutely true.
Yeah.
How do chicks avoid predation? All about sort of dive bombing. Whiffling, have you ever heard of whiffling?
Whiffling, no.
Whiffling's quite interesting. It's where a bird sort of often twists its body, but its head's the right way around to suddenly drop height. You see it in geese and eagles and things. That's pretty good. We often see it on the Isle of Skye. Why are some chicks altracial white while others are precoital? It's unbelievable. Just the level of detail. I don't even know what that means.
You've got full nerd now.
Can birds see in the UV spectrum? What is a nictitating membrane?
The answer to that is yes, by the way.
Yeah.
See in UV.
Yeah, well, some birds definitely can, especially UK kestrels. They can. How do snake eagles?
Of the voles and things that they're
absolutely. How do snake eagles protect themselves from being bitten by prey? Why do spoonbills have a strangely shaped bill? So it's an absolutely fantastic book, and it's brilliant. Yeah. So
why do baby spoonbills sound like R2D2?
It wasn't R2D2. It was the little. Oh God, going full nerd.
Oh, that was the little toaster things, wasn't it? The racing around. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we've gone down a little bit of a cul-de-sac there. Yeah. Anyway, the author has a really good knack of explaining all this in a really engaging, easy to read way. No dry science speak here. We both think one of the best things about this book is how it makes you look at birds differently. It's not just about identifying them, it's about really understanding their behaviours, quirks and survival strategies. Whether you're a hardcore birder or just somebody who enjoys spotting and learning about wildlife, Beat About the Bush Birds is packed with stuff that will really engage your interest. And this kind of stuff, we really like to talk about it on our own photo safaris as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something else I'll just add to that is what I like about this book is, although it is based around African birds, a lot of those things that I've just mentioned are absolutely sort of generic to birds internationally.
UK, Europe, Asia, whatever.
So you don't really have to sort of be a sort of African birder to be able to take something from this book and learn it and apply it wherever you are geographically around the world, I think.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Speaking of our own photography safaris, our 2025 Wild at Matikoko trip filled up on New Year's Day, I believe. Might be even New Year's Eve, I can't remember, but it doesn't matter.
It was around then.
But so 2026 is now available for booking on our website. We're also adding a March date, March the 11th to be precise, and just like our August departure, there will be 7 or 11 night options in there as well. Some people like to go for 7, some people like to go for 11, so we offer both.
Yeah. Alan's put in the notes here. KZ, explain the difference between 7 and 11 night trips. Well, one's 7 nights. No. That's when you spend 7 nights there. And the other one's where you go for 11.
All right, dickhead. So I'm pretty sure what I actually said was explain the difference between the March and the September trips, not the difference between 7 and 11 nights.
I beg to differ.
God. So I'm just going to have a beer. Sorry.
All right, fair enough. Cheers.
So, I'll do it.
Go on then.
In September...
Seems like I can't be trusted.
We see the Great Migration. August, September, we see the Great Migration. Thousands of wildebeest moving across the dry savannah looking for good quality grass. In March, the savannah is much more green. Rainy season's been on and gone, or is sometimes still there. And it sort of just totally transforms the landscape. There's often more watering holes, floodplains. We'll see more hippos taking advantage of the water. There's more water birds. We still have the same big cats and the other megafauna, but the landscape looks really, really different. It's usually much more green and lush. There's often more younger animals, especially like antelopes, giraffes, zebra. So it's pretty much the same sort of species, but just in different circumstances, and it looks very different.
It's a bit different, yeah.
I remember photographing Kasaru in 2019 on those dry grass termite mounds, and everything was sort of very, very, very dry. And then when I went back in March, we saw her again, and obviously the cubs were that little bit older, but everything was just bright, lush green. Yeah. And it really does change things. It makes a bit of a difference. So anyway, both trips are now booking for 2026, so please do go and have a look and book up, because it's a fantastic trip, as we know.
Yes.
Anyway, I know this is our birding special, but this for me is just too much of a burning issue. We're going to talk about cheetahs, and we're going to specifically, if I can say it, we're going to specifically talk about cheetahs and vehicles.
Is this where you lose your rag and vent your spleen?
Yes. I'm not going to get that angry, but let's just
throw something.
Just have some more beer. Just
throw
more
that
beer.
book.
Yeah, throw that book. I think I broke the floor actually. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not going to. Yeah, let's just say I'm going to vent my annoyance and indignation. Is indignation the right word?
It is.
It is. Yeah,
absolutely.
Do you remember a few years ago when we saw a well-known cheetah called Malaika in the Masai Mara National Reserve?
I do, yeah. She's very well known, or she was very, very well known, bit of an international superstar, actually, of a cheetah. Featured regularly in various nature documentaries. A cheetah supermodel, actually. Incidentally, Malaika
all
means...
cheetahs are supermodels.
Well, yeah, that's true, according to you. Yeah, that's fair enough, actually. Yeah, they are very good-looking cats, I have to say. Yeah. Anyway, did you know that Malaika means angel?
I didn't.
In Swahili.
Oh.
And I think possibly Arabic as well.
Really?
I think there's a link
there
between
is definitely a link between
Arabic
Swahili
and Swahili.
Yeah, definitely,
anyway,
100%.
There you go. Or Kiswahili.
Kiswahili.
Which I think is how you refer to the language.
Well, yeah, because when I was in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, there is a much more Arabic influence in that part of Eastern Africa, and they do speak Swahili down there as well. So, yeah.
There you go.
So, yes, that's her. Incidentally, as well, though, our well-known cheetah, Kasaru, who is no longer with us, she is a direct descendant of Malaika. I don't think it's a daughter, maybe a granddaughter. I don't know.
No, I'm not sure.
Anyway, Malaika developed a bit of a sort of habit of jumping onto the bonnets and roofs of safari vehicles. It's quite intelligent, to be fair. So let's start with why cheetahs are going to do this, okay? So these big cats are using their sight more than their scent when they're hunting. And in the open plains of places like the Masai Mara, Malaika learned that she could use safari vehicles as a sort of surrogate termite mound to gain height, to help her scan for prey.
Because you often see them in the Mara just sitting on top of a
termite.
They'll just chill out, but you can see them actually just looking around all the time.
And Kasaru used to do that as well, not just looking for potential prey, but looking for threats to her cubs as well. You know. So I don't doubt that if you're a guest in a vehicle, it will absolutely be a pretty jaw-dropping experience to have a cheetah jump on the bonnet or the roof. And it might seem like an incredible once-in-a-lifetime experience, but just because they can, it doesn't mean that they should. You know, allowing cheetahs to climb onto vehicles is absolutely irresponsible. It actively harms their natural behaviour. It puts both the wildlife and people at risk. And it's just a pretty significant major failure in ethical wildlife guiding.
Yeah.
So when we were out there and we saw Malaika and she was eyeing up our vehicle, okay?
Yeah.
And Boston, who was our guide, he knew that. And I also remember having this chat with Moses afterwards. Moses was kind of saying, he said he was saying to himself, "Start your engine, Boston, start your engine." And as she looked at our vehicle, Boston, and he started his engine as she approached, and that's all he had to do. And that noise of the engine, the diesel engine started, it was absolutely enough to dissuade her from jumping up on top of the vehicle.
Yeah. So now we know why they do it. I mean, it's like a big metal termite mound for scanning the horizon, but the issue is why it's not ethically acceptable. It encourages a potentially dangerous habituation, with humans if they associate vehicles and people with safety or as a means of gaining a hunting advantage. They become vulnerable. Perhaps poachers or others who might cause harm, or maybe people self-driving who panic. I mean, cheetah jumps up, on your vehicle, you go, okay. That might cause harm to them or you. For younger cheetahs, having repeated close interactions with vehicles can interfere with their natural learning process of how they hunt and how they just behave generally. They should be developing skills to navigate the wild on their own, in terms of not relying on vehicles. It's also unsafe for people inside the vehicle. Cheetahs aren't considered a threat to humans, but they're still wild predators. We're often in open-sided vehicles with a large open roof or open side, which whatever it is. there's a lot of space for these large predators to come in if they wanted to.
Yeah.
They don't see us
No.
as people, actually.
No.
They see us as a vehicle or a shape that they can sort of get on or in. But, what you don't want is for that sort of almost fourth wall to bring a movie sort of thing in to be broken.
Yeah.
So, if they're encouraged to be on or in a vehicle, that's not good for them or for the people in the vehicle as well. I certainly wouldn't like a bite or a scratch from a cheetah, if it felt it. 'Cause especially if you made a sudden move in response to it coming in,
fright or
it
flight,
might actually,
isn't it?
it might
Circle
feel
of fear.
that it's really threatened and it might lash out.
So, as we said, Boston started the engine, and that put Malika off. We knew she was eyeing up the roof space of the vehicle or the bonnet. We have no doubt of that at all. Boston knew it. I knew it. Moses knew it. And as is often the case, there is a sort of blissful sort of ignorance here. We see a fair bit of this sort of wildlife encounter in the media, in the press, social media, whatever, and the way it's sort of written up in headlines and segues is in a way that talks about a thrilling wildlife encounter. Sensationalizes, exactly, that's a good word. But there's never a reference to the ethics and the potential dangers to the cheetah. We know rangers will fine Kenya Wildlife Service or Lemmick or Conservancy rangers, doesn't matter where you are really. And they will potentially ban guides and visitors from the reserves if they feel... We have seen it, yeah. If they feel that not enough was done to dissuade the cheetah from doing this. And it's absolutely the right thing to enforce those ethical standards. Yes, sometimes you can't do absolutely everything. You can start your engine, you can make a little bit of a noise perhaps, but you can't necessarily move away, because in the act of moving away you could actually cause a bit of an injury to the cheetah. So it's not that they will automatically ban guides. If they feel you didn't do enough, then they will. So there's a bit of subjectivity, but none of that really escapes the point that it's wrong. It's absolutely the right thing to enforce these standards, and no photograph is more important than the well-being of the subject. And the best, as we know, as most people will know, the best true wildlife experiences come from observing and photographing wildlife and animals, behaving as they do naturally. So since September, on the 10th of each month to be precise, Wild Planet Photo magazine is running an advert for a photography safari by another company on Instagram, and that advert is a photograph of 3 cheetahs, 2 older juveniles, sub-adults, I'm not sure, and an adult, and what they're doing in this photograph is climbing all over the safari vehicle. And I've got it here, and there you go. That's an advert for a photography safari. That's an advert for a photography safari. Yeah.
I have to say, I'm disappointed. I used to do a lot of writing for Wild Planet Photo magazine when it first came out. A lot of articles for them. I really like them. I've got a lot of time for them.
They've had an editorial change since then.
Have they really?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't kept in touch with them. But I'm disappointed at that. That's irresponsible.
It is. Yeah. It's terrible.
Yeah. Exposure Tours, who so that is that who's running?
So they're running the safari, and Wild Planet Photo are advertising it as well.
It sort of strikes me that they're not applying editorial control over what their adverts are doing. I'm very disappointed.
It's disappointing, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
I think when a tour company uses images like this for marketing, and then you've got that's one thing. You've got the tour company doing it, but then you've got a magazine like Wild Planet, who should be quite respected in the industry. They're publishing the advert. It effectively means to me that both of them are endorsing the message that this type of wildlife interaction is absolutely acceptable, desirable, or even standard practice. They're saying, wow, look at this, isn't it great? It's an advert. They're trying to show how good something is, and it's really not good at all. It encourages unethical, dangerous practice, potentially leading to irresponsible behaviour in the field. It's undermining the efforts made to encourage ethical and sustainable wildlife watching. Something, it's really important in places like the Mara, especially the National Reserve, ultimately the National Reserve, where it is a very fine line between enjoying the experience and the sustainability of the ecosystem and excessive disturbance. So like you, very disappointed in Wildlife Photo magazine for their part it's basically sensationalising this sort of close encounter rather than promoting ethical and sustainable wildlife encounters.
I mean, at worst, they've just not realised that that's there, but they should be checking all of the adverts anyway.
Well, they should, I don't think
best,
ignorance is an excuse.
At worst,
I don't think
encouraging it. That's not good.
Ignorance isn't an excuse, really, is it?
No. No.
I did reach out to them via their Instagram page. I can't remember exactly what I said, but my comment disappeared rather quickly.
Right. Did it start with, and another thing?
But it came up again in December, and I'm going to paraphrase here. And I said something like, using this photo like it's a good thing is wrong. It's a poor ethical example, and allowing cheetahs to jump on vehicles not only puts them at risk, but it can injure guests. Guides can be banned from reserves if rangers feel that didn't do enough to dissuade the behaviour, and they need to remove that sort of photograph from their media. And I know another photographer added something similar to my comment, as have one or two others, but there's no response from the advertiser and no response from the tour company involved. And the same image has been used again in January, February. It'll probably be used again on the 10th of March as well, if it's a sort of, it seems to be the 10th of every month since September. And over this time, it receives hundreds and hundreds of interactions. Now, if there are this is my opinion, if there are tour companies and wildlife photography magazines who cannot lead by example, okay, not only lead by example, but they're also actively promoting poor ethics, then really the battle's lost.
It's not good, is it? I mean, I can understand as a sort of average punter who's maybe never been on safari, doesn't understand the consequences of animal behaviour or whatever, thinks, wow, that's cool. Can you imagine that? I mean, it's an understandable reaction, but
I can see that.
It shouldn't get to that point where people are being promoted that image.
No,
because it's not good for the wildlife, and it's also not good for the guides, as we've discussed before, because they might never be able to work in that area again.
Absolutely, yeah. And the guides are under pressure, and people see. We've spoke to our friends in Namara, Moses, Boston, James, Joseph, these guys who we know, and we've heard horror stories from them, how certain guests that they've experienced are very sort of over the top in trying to get what they want and don't seem to care about the ethics. And it puts the Maasai lads in a very, very difficult position, because obviously they have rules, they have guidelines, they have ethics that they need to follow.
It's their livelihood.
It is, and the tourists need to be aware. If what the guide says, that's it. Yeah, that's where the buck stops.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so I think the key is if you're planning a safari, be part of the solution. Don't be part of the problem. Support responsible operators. Respectfully question any perception of unethical practices, because the reason I say respectfully question is because sometimes things can look a little bit odd, but often there's underlying reasons for things as well. So yes, that is what I was getting angry about with a well-known photography magazine.
I can see your spleen.
Yeah, I've vented it, Before we say that is the end of the episode 13 of the podcast, we haven't talked about our beer. We always talk about our beer. So what have we been drinking? Well, we've both been drinking 9-hop pale ale, which is very, very nice, it has to be said. Kent pale ale, it's very, very nice. You have gone on to something a little bit darker.
Well, I have, but before that, I started on the Duration Sweeping Coast.
Right.
Which is very nice. And this one, this one's...
smells rank.
What is this one? So it's Vocation Brewery Caramel Cookie Naughty and Nice Chocolate Stout.
Nah, it smells...
So it's...
it smells all sweet.
I'll tell you what, it's, when you're in the swimming pool, but it's actually...
Somebody has a shit. I've never been in this swimming pool. What kind of swim? Have you been in the hippo pool with the hippos?
Floater.
You've been able to swim with the hippos, haven't you?
I have, yes, yeah. So
That's not
That's
nice. It's not pleasant.
totally derailed me. So this is like doing a length in chocolate cake.
It's not nice. It's not a nice beer.
I like it.
No, not my thing. I like dark beers, but I don't like all this sweet, chocolatey caramel bollocks. Like,
Well, I think after several of those,
Yeah,
it's
I mean-
quite an interesting sort of wildie to chuck in. And then we'll have something
Anyway.
different in the pub.
yeah. Anyway,
So
where were we?
I have no idea. Well, hope you've enjoyed episode 13. We certainly have.
Well, we denied being bird nerds to start with, but I think we've actually proved that we are bird nerds.
Oh, God, yeah,
You know what
through
I
and
mean?
through,
Yeah.
through and through.
Okay.
Yeah. If you haven't guessed it by now, we run photo safaris in Africa. Our 2025 trip is full, but we still have a March 2026 trip, as well as our usual August and September trip in 2026. I'll put the website and the email on the screen, as you can probably catch us on the socials as well, and all that, yada, yada, yada. Happy photographing.
Yes.
Ta-ta.
Happy ethical photography.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cheers.